Good afternoon, everyone in the audience. Welcome back from lunch. Sounds like everyone in the audience is quite energized, and I think you find that after a good meal, you get that burst of energy. So we're looking forward to capitalizing on that energy we've all got for lunch from what's going to be a fantastic speech today. Just one very quick question before I get started. Have I got three people at the back? If you could stand up very quickly. The three very back left seats. The three people, if you can stand up very quickly. The three people standing. We've got 3 seats reserved for you up the front if you want to make your way forward. I've always wanted to do that, when people are sitting up at the back. But anyway, my name is Gareth Rhode, and I lead the consulting practice inside AMP. I'm fortunate enough to be your host today for this very, very exciting Amplify presentation on redesigning healthcare and the role of empathy for breakthrough transformation. So I'd like to welcome everyone here today, our visitors, AMP staff, and members of the AMP leadership team, as well as those people viewing online today. So from a housekeeping point of view, the way the session will run today is we've got our guest speaker will talk for 25 minutes, then we'll have an open Q&A session for 20 minutes, and being Amplify and about innovation, we're really looking to have a very energized and open conversation in that time. We also have a Twitter handle, #AmplifyFest, where you can contribute your questions online. We'll start wrapping up the session about 5-10 minutes before the end, so we can allow the other session to come in. So today's session is particularly exciting as an AMP person in the context of what we're going through as an organisation and the journey we have for customer centricity. And it's around how service industries are being disrupted, driven by changing customer expectations and significant shifts in business models. As we look into the future, one of the major trends shaping today and tomorrow's business is people are living and working longer. So therefore, it's critical to find better solutions to address these changes to meet these various needs of customers. Our speaker today, Lorna Ross, brings extensive leading insight into these topics. She has 24 years' experience working in design and design research and innovation, with the past 12 years focused on health and healthcare. The Mayo Clinic Centre for Innovation is the 5th innovation group she has worked in. She's a graduate of the Royal College of Art, London, England. Prior to joining the Centre of Innovation at Mayo Clinic as a manager for the design group in 2009, Lorna ran the Human Wellbeing Group at the MIT Media Lab Europe. She has led large-scale strategic design projects for the Department of Defence, Motorola, Interfor Research Corporation, and the Massachusetts General Hospital. She is recognised internationally as an expert in design innovation and speaks frequently in the US, Europe and Asia. At Mayo, Ross holds a strategic leadership position in the Centre for Innovation, where she directs the discovery and implementation of transformative patient-centric care models. She works closely with both internal practice stakeholders and external industry partners to explore emerging healthcare landscape and how Mayo can continue to bring meaningful value to people everywhere. So it's with my great pleasure to welcome Lorna up on the stage.
I thought I'd sit. Can you guys hear me? I felt more comfortable. I've got a clicker. So the most important thing that you guys need to know about me is that I'm Irish. So hello, all you Irish people out there. It's always important. Where am I going to look? I'm going to look there. So it's really been a great morning. We've had this great speakers, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm here with a colleague of mine who's hiding somewhere, Marnie Myler. So she's here also from Mayo, and I'm going to go quickly because I only have 25 minutes. So designing for consequence. I really like this idea, and people keep telling me not to use the word consequence because it's really negative. But I think it really describes what we're trying to do with the service design at Mayo Clinic and in general, is that we really want to have impact. And sometimes in innovation there has to be casualties. And so I think the word consequence is intentionally provocative for that reason. So this is Mayo Clinic. It's in Rochester, Minnesota. I'm assuming no one here has been. Maybe Heather, you've been. But what's interesting about it, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. Part of what happens when you go, I mean, I've worked in 5 different innovation groups in different industries, and a really helpful thing to do as a designer is to understand the culture when you go into a place. And so when I first started at Mayo, I started to kind of like analyze what the parameters for innovation were going to be there. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of these. And apparently these are going to be really familiar to many of you. So it's really old. It's 150 years old. And so there's an inherent kind of resistance maybe to change when something's been successful. We've been successful for 150 years. And so when you go in somewhere and you realize that people have been doing the thing the same way and it's been working for a long time, you're going to get a lot of resistance to change. It's big. It's 65,000 employees. And so when you start to propose things that are disruptive in an environment like that, there's a lot of people that may be impacted. So you've got a lot of people to consider in terms of the, consequence of change. And you have to upfront really address that. You can't ignore that fact. 30 to 1 administrators and physicians. And so the primary service model is, face-to-face physicians seeing patients. And yet for every physician, we have 30 administrators. So we're instantly really bureaucratic. And so that's another kind of characteristic of our group or our institution. I'm going to skip some not-for-profit. This is really a kind of unique constraint and kind of cultural constraint, because the same incentives that you would have in a corporate culture in terms of trying to drive change and the nature of how the kind of levers that you use to manage that change aren't necessarily there. So we can't incentivize people in the same way. And so I think being a not-for-profit makes very indirect ways that you have to really motivate people to change. We're physician-led, and so a lot of medical institutions are administrative-led. So you have the kind of business model, and then you have the medical profession. We're run by physicians, and they make all the decisions. And so they're very, obviously they're scientists. And so, working in the innovation group, they talk about certainty and proof, evidence and proof, before anything can be decided and can be validated as being actually real. And so it's very challenging working with the scientific community when you're often asking for a leap of faith. And then we have an indirect value model in that we have the insurance companies essentially are our client. And so we have a set of products that are sold to insurance companies, but the people that consume that product are the patients. And so there's kind of an elephant in the room. And so this is, so for me going into Mayo Clinic, you have to acknowledge these things. It's really important. And I had heard from Garrett, this is going to be quite similar to many aspects of your industry being in. So another thing you do as a designer is you tend to notice this kind of stuff. You're like, oh, that's really cool. Like, nothing's changed in 60 years. You're like, so, we talk about, again, design is a lot about the different kind of indicators of, you can see cultures reflected in things, and what we call the built environment is a really, really vivid kind of reflection of what's happening in your culture. And so you start to see the fact that we actually lost a window and got a computer. So that's progress. But I think, it really starts to hint at there's, healthcare and the clinical setting. So the healthcare industry is a huge industry, and the clinical setting is the kind of front door to that industry. And it's where we deliver value and where we exchange our products. And you start to see that the kind of rituals and the kind of hierarchy are being really maintained, and that there's a real investment in sustaining those rituals. This is Mayo Clinic as it's kind of grown, and this is, it's characteristic of what happens in medicine is that you go from having a doctor who pretty much looks after everything, the original model of a physician. And as they become more specialized, you have people who kind of become, the practice itself fractures. And so this is an example of the growth of Mayo Clinic into a set of really kind of different practice areas or medical areas. And so if we take one of those, like internal medicine, so one of this, and you think about subspecialization, and then you think about subspecialization, and then you have people practicing, and you get this fractal model. And so this is why it's so important, is that it's really hard to standardize. I mean, if you think about any industry that's kind of grown organically this way, the nature of how they identify as the same thing, I mean, they just don't identify as the same practice anymore. And so, when we're looking at scaling our models, thinking about an innovative process and then trying to scale it, I mentioned this earlier today, you can go to one tiny part of one of these subspecialties and you can run an experiment, and Marnie's done this a ton, and it can be really successful, and then you go next door and the physician next door says, well, we're really different, so we're really not like them, so your thing's not going to work here. And so I think this fracturing is another kind of constraint that we've had to. So healthcare is a system, and it's optimized to mitigate risk and not create value. And this is something that you discover when you really examine it. It's not something that it's explicitly stated, but you really start to see what the real primary activity is. And so when people go to work every day in the healthcare setting, the most important thing is to mitigate risk. And so we've become less and less aware of how to create value. And the classic response, I think, again, to scale, and I showed you this kind of scaling of our practice, is that you start to rely really strongly on standardization. You start to really try and stabilize your model so you can scale it and so you can sell it, essentially, and so you can reproduce it. And that has worked for Mayo in the past, but I love this quote about, the risk in that is that you can get really, better and better at doing the wrong thing. So I think everyone runs the risk as you get really big, is that you start to make all the decisions about how you're going to stabilize your model, how you're going to kind of make it more accessible, how you're going to make it cheaper, how you're going to drive down costs, where you're going to find efficiencies, and you could be getting really good at doing the wrong thing. And that's really hard to even know yourself. So our industry, healthcare, is being not just disrupted, it's being blown up, essentially. It's kind of a lot more scary. And so this was a piece from a PricewaterhouseCoopers did a report recently on the kind of entrance, the new entrance in America into the healthcare market. And so they looked at the Fortune 50 companies, so not just the little startup in the Silicon Valley, but these are the top companies that have established markets, they have infrastructure, they have a lot of kind of existing kind of assets. And of 50 of them, half of them identify healthcare as their market, their emerging market. And none of them are medical, none of them are clinical. And so it's a bit like discovering that the top half of the top industries in Australia had suddenly decided they were going to go after your customer. And so it's a real imperative. It's something that we really have to pay attention to. So we do a lot of trending. So some of the stuff that we do at Mayo is to try and get them to pay attention to stuff like that. And so I really love this idea, just kind of understanding and characterizing what's happening with the mega trend. And I don't know how much time you look at adjacent industries and this kind of confluence when you get lots of different things happening, and in combination become pretty terrifying. But I like this kind of I guess just description of what a mega trend is. It's the capacity to dissolve traditional market boundaries and rewrite established industry segmentation. And that's what's happening in healthcare right now. In addition to its impact, it can be experienced as a set of consequences or shock waves. And so we try and talk at Mayo about not looking at a traditional competition. We think about traditional competition as the other big clinics and the ones that are identified as the big medical institutions, and more about adjacent industries. And so you're thinking about adjacency in terms of to your market and where the disruptors are going to come from. Experience economy, we talk a lot about that also because we work a lot in the area of the patient experience. But I really like the idea that your competition will not be the same product. It's going to be the one that has the same effect. This is really important, and this has been probably the single most important thing for us to understand, is that we're not looking at people making healthcare products. We're looking at people who give people the same effect. And so I think as you reframe, we were talking earlier today about the idea of reframing, you have to start to reframe and talk about your products, not as the names you give them, the things you call them, but start to talk about it in terms of the effect they're having. So let's talk a bit about design at Mayo Clinic. So you really have to think about for us at Mayo, we've tried to kind of promote or propose the idea that it's not about fixing a broken model. The model of healthcare is so broken that it's not a lot of point fixing it. So, getting really distracted. And again, I've worked in a lot of different innovation groups, and they have in common is that innovation is often like a knee-jerk response to risk or fear or something's happening in your market, and people are like, oh, we should start an innovation group because that's a really good thing to do to stop the future happening. Like it's somehow going to stop things happening. And I think it's really important to not try and fix broken models. It's to really use the opportunity to think about an alternative future. And so that's why creativity matters more and more in these moments when you're not trying to drive efficiency and kind of reinforce the model you already have. It's actually trying to let go of that model and think about things differently. So again, there's no answers anymore. I mean, I think that's a big part of a culture as you make decisions, is your job is not, or your role is not to come up with answers, is to come up with ideas. I mean, I would say as you kind of go into work every day, you're spending less and less time focusing on answers and more on ideas. This is something that traditionally as a designer, I think what's most important, and it's design is aspirational. And so I had used this quote like 25 years ago when I was doing my thesis about, we never design for how we are, but how we wish to be. And I think really inherent in design is that it's about the future and it's aspirational. So at its core, it is about kind of thinking about the future and thinking about a better future. Really quickly, human-centered design. I don't know how many of you have heard this term. Hands? Maybe? Lots. Okay, so really, really good. I think what's most important about it in the context of healthcare and also for you guys is it's a process, of progressive inquiry where concepts and solutions emerge through close collaboration with the user. Right, that's really obvious. It's about collaborating. It helps you understand the role of the user in your system. So it really forces you to think about your system and forces you to identify the role of your user as an asset and as a functional part of that system. And that's really important. They're not a passive part, they're an active part. It helps you understand both a user's capacity but also their limitations. So often we want people to do certain things in the system, in our models, but they often have limitations. So as much as it's about understanding what they're capable of, it's also being really respectful of limitations. And that's healthcare. We have to be careful of that. To determine where resources will have the greatest impact. So you've got a set of assets. You're 160-something years old, AMP. You've got so many, you've invested so much and you have so many assets. And you really have to figure out, by working through human-centered design, you start to figure out which of those assets are creating value for you. Which of them are perceivable as valuable to the customer. And again, where is your assets perceivable? And the last one is to help optimize any system for the human. It examines the system from the end user and drives adaptation that benefits. So it's very much about the user. I'll leave that one. Design is human-centered innovation. So this is like a really charming and kind of obvious, but I think it explains, a lot about, and we talk about pathways in healthcare systems, and a lot of what we notice is patients kind of using a system in a way that is often characterized as deviant, where they're doing things that we don't want them to do, or they're doing things the way we told you to do it this way, and you're doing it this way. And so this kind of deviant behavior is often people finding really efficient pathways to get what they want out of the system. And so a huge part of design is paying attention to the paths that people are wearing. And often it's like not putting your energy into trying to get them to do what you want them to do, but just really pay attention to what they're doing. This was an example of a beautiful design of a quad that happened at, I think it was at Duke University in the US, and they essentially left this quad unpaved for a year, and were able to just kind of establish what is considered a really beautiful design. It's based on how people used that. And so again, I really like it as an example of allowing people to inhabit a system and kind of paying attention to what they're doing. Then you have really elaborately designed systems like this where where you've got lots of reasons why you're going to create this really curated way of kind of controlling the traffic flow and trying to get people to behave a certain way. And your user is always way smarter than you are. And I think it's kind of a really good example of how systems can become too elaborate and then users just work around them. So pay attention to the people who are deviant to your systems. This is a really good slide because it makes people gag. So let's talk about healthcare. We have discovered through extensive time, we spend all our time with patients and kind of looking at their experience. And what we do it is because we want to see the system through their eyes. We want to be able to tell the people who are developing and kind of sustaining these models what it feels like from a user perspective. And so one thing we know is that the experience there's a lot of brutality in healthcare. I mean, we have a very unusual customer in that No one really says, I really, really want to go and use healthcare today. I'm really excited about going. It's different than getting a cup of coffee. I mean, you're not going to get excited about going and sitting in the emergency department or having your hip replaced. So you already have a very atypical user population, and yet they still have a kind of service expectations. They're just quite unusual. So we know there's a lot of brutality in healthcare. The experience of treatment is often worse than the experience of the disease. And so what you're selling is really hard to sell because people are like, I think I might just not do that. I think I might just keep limping because, getting a new hip is really scary. So you're often trying to convince people to do things, and the proposition and what you're proposing is really intimidating. And their capacity to make choices and to kind of really opt into a really scary situation. This happens, this is something that was said, and this was actually a patient who had been brought in after a car accident and had spent a year or longer recuperating and being, basically put back together, and then having to kind of do a lot of physio and saying, I get it, you guys saved my life, but quite frankly, you almost killed me doing it. And so the experience of you saving me from dying was so horrific that from an experience perspective, and so that's not good. People have extreme and extraordinary preferences, and so I used to work for the Department of Defense. You had mentioned that, and so we used to work with a lot of soldier, special operations, Navy SEALs, a lot of the kind of extreme users in that community. And one thing that they once said to me when I was trying to understand their needs, I've got 9 minutes, that's really bad, it was that I was trying to kind of like interview them to figure out what we could help, in terms of building equipment for them, and they're kind of mostly what they were wearing. And this guy said, you have to understand, we have like really extreme and extraordinary preferences. We're not like other people. We don't have the same preference hierarchy. And so I really, having had that said to me, it really resonated coming into healthcare, is that people are so impacted by either their own disease or the consideration of being really sick or a loved one being sick. And so you really have to understand how skewed and how their perspective is so compromised, and their capacity to make good decisions and their capacity to cope is very, very different. So I think this idea of having extreme and extraordinary preferences really, really works in healthcare. People fear the consequence of illness more than the illness itself. This is back to the treatment, but consequence, the social implications, and particularly in the States, social, financial implications, the stigma around being diagnosed, particularly with chronic diseases. There's so much stigma with that, and then there's so much expectations that you're supposed to do things. If you're sick, if you're diagnosed with cancer, the expectation is you're supposed to stop everything else and spend all your time thinking about your cancer. And that's kind of the proposition. And so people really, really try and avoid diagnosis. And so there's we talk a lot about, back to Mayo, about let's treat not the disease, but the consequence and the implications of the disease. So when you think about what's going to happen to a person, really consider all the things, how it's going to impact them. So we had traditionally used a lot of ethnography in terms of trying to understand our user. And I feel that ethnography is a bit like this kind of what you can see is 5% of what's really going on. And so you start to study people in an environment like a healthcare setting, and you start to kind of see behaviors, and then you have to make assumptions about what you're seeing, because that's what ethnographers do. Maybe you interview them and still they can articulate something, but you're making a lot of assumptions. And so I think what's hidden is less about how people are acting out, but really values and beliefs. And so we've had to really try and figure out how to get at that. One thing we do a lot of is personas, and this is a standard thing that a lot of design firms use, and it's really trying to kind of storytell around the voice of the patient, and they tend to be kind of composites where we spend hours and hours and hours with patients and then play back narratives where we talk about their needs and their preferences, their biases, their social situation. And what's most powerful with personas is that you create a set, and this was one of 8, and then you completely contradict the needs. And so you say, persona A really has preferences and needs around this kind of treatment or these kind of options or this kind of care. Persona B would hate that. And so what you're doing is you're trying to move away from the stereotypes that tend to get used when people kind of stereotype patients as being the same. And then being a design group, we do lots of kind of these mappings. So this is the 4 different kind of signatures of different types of patients moving through the same care plan. And so based on, if you're progressive or remissive in terms of where your disease is going, or what kind of, you're having a procedure, you tend to have these signatures of experiences. And so again, before Mayo had invested in the design group, this stuff had never been visualized. And so being able to kind of create these artifacts, being able to create, ways of talking about, and so for you, ways of talking about your customer. You need to create something that becomes representation, like really tangible artifacts that represent your customer, and not just in one way. So thinking about the tools that you use in your everyday to represent customers. We do like service journey mapping a lot, and that's another thing that is standard in service design. And what's most important at it looks at all your touch points, and so you have a services and you have touch points, and they have the customer. And when we look at gaps in that, I don't have a pointer, do I? But what's really important about the gaps in healthcare is that our time with patients is getting more and more compressed. And so what we do is we pay attention to the gaps in between the clinical time and ask questions about what products and services could really amplify the time with the physician, because if we're going to get that more and more compressed, how do we start to kind of amplify it at the edges? And so we do this to show where the opportunities are. So this is something that we realized really recently. Patients don't want to know what Mayo knows. They want to know how we know it. And I think this is really important for other kind of consultative type, is that we've been working a lot at scaling what Mayo knows. We've had all these conversations about how can we take Mayo knowledge and make it accessible, through different decision tools and through different relationships we have. And people actually don't want to know what we know. They want to know how we know it. And it's a really subtle difference, but we can tell people what we think and what we know, and they kind of get it, but they want to know, how did you figure that out? And the thought process behind it is way more interesting to people. And in terms of establishing trust and people actually believing you, it's telling them how you know something, not just what you know. And I think it really comes down to the role of the kind of expert is becoming very kind of, irrelevant. People don't want someone to tell them what to do. They want someone to help them understand the process of thinking about things. So we do a lot of decision tools. We build a lot of these kind of decision aids, and we've found there's so much interesting things happening when you put decision aids into a clinical setting. So not only do you and Marnie actually had done some great work where we had created these decision tools for a group of young adults in terms of like making kind of health decisions. And one of the nurses working in this university said, what's fascinating about health tools is that you go from making decisions where the patient is accessing a kind of an emotional part of their brain, trying to kind of make decisions and trying to consider the impact and implications. If you put a tool in the room, if you put something on the table and you say, let's talk about this and not about you, let's talk about this, they actually access a much more cognitive part of their brain, and they're able to make much more rational and kind of way more sophisticated decision-making process, because they're not compromised by the emotion of having to make a decision, and they don't feel judged. And so again, back to having design, these things matter, because if you build tools, you can really change the dynamics of conversations, and you can really kind of really trigger different types of conversations, different decisions. And I think being able to build these tools becomes really important. And we did that a lot for Mayo, as we say, there's a real absence of a tool here. We need to build one for you. We do a lot of discovery tools. So when we go into different clinical environments, we really have to figure out how we're going to kind of pull that information out. I'll give you examples. So this was, maybe I'll move to the next one. This is when we did some work in the kind of surgical suites looking at communication. There was a real inconsistency in terms of how the surgical teams were communicating. And they actually didn't really identify communication as part of the service model or as part of the kind of what they were doing. We hadn't said, good communication is one of the most important things in medicine. We hadn't ever said that. And so the chair of the Department of Medicine really wanted us, or Department of Surgery really wanted us to highlight the role of communication. And we went in and we spent a lot of time and what's curious about doing observations in a, oh my God, 1 minute, doing observations, I'm going to go 5 minutes over. Doing observations in a surgical suite is that, it's freezing cold. We did bypass surgery, so they're 15, 16 hours long. They're called cabbage, so it's kind of coronary bypass, and so it's really intense, and the teams change. And they put you sitting in the back of the room because it's the only place you're not going to basically pull a plug out and kill someone. And then you've got your notebook, and you're standing there going, I have no idea what's going on here. I mean, I can kind of see something, and my fingers are numb, and my feet are dead. So then we pulled out, and we're like, we're not going to be able to do this because there's so much obscurity in this environment, and they get it, and we don't get it. And so we got permission to go back in when it wasn't being used and did these renderings of this space and said, we now need to create tools that when we go back in, we can actually start to kind of plan how we're going to grab data out of this. And that became a really important lesson for us, is the degree to which we need to design, we need to know what we're looking for, and we need to figure out how do we, it's like building a camera to photograph ghosts. I had mentioned this. You have to figure out, everything's so obscure in these environments, and so you have to create these tools. This is my favorite one. We did this maps of the surgeon, and we had all the different people on the surgical team kind of map the different things they touched and the places they got information and how information moved around. And then what was curious was we compared all the different experience, and we were looking at cognitive load and risk in terms of, where the most communication was getting lost or not being moved, and so things that were not captured but said, so things get spoken but not written down, things that get written down but not spoken. So we came up with these different kind of ways of talking about communication. We went back and said to the surgeon, your biggest risk is your circulating nurse, because if you look at the kind of the load that you've put on this person in terms of her, her capacity to function and her capacity to kind of maintain that level of functionality for 15 hours, the surgeon's standing still, the pulmonologist is sitting behind the pump, the anesthesiologist. These are all the really high-paid people in the room. Your nurse is your greatest kind of risk. And so saying this back to the Department of Surgery, I remember they were like, well, we're not the Department of Nursing, so why are you telling us this? And so we said, if you're a team, you should care about this. And so if we hadn't created these maps, we would never have had that conversation. So I think this idea of visualizing and making maps is really important. So design's not about, I don't think it's a solution. People misunderstand maybe the idea that design is all about coming up with solutions. And I think it's much more about the process. I find design to be really powerful as a process. And I think, when you think about moving from an existing state or an existing model to one that's a future model where you're not really certain which one to move and how to create a future model, you really have to have some just some framework. And if you could, let me skip that because I want to show you this. I love describing it as two. It's either like scaffolding. So design is particularly in complex environments where you're trying to think about a future and where you guys want to go with your business. It's either like building a scaffold to then build on top of. So what are the basics that you need to put in the future that give you enough of a way of moving there? Or it's like training wheels. And we talk a lot about the tools that we build, and we give them to different departments, and we'll say, can you guys just use this for like a week? And we're trying to trigger a different conversation with patients. We're trying to get you to make decisions more transparently. We're trying to get you to talk about money. We're trying to get the team to work differently. And then you can stop using it. But we're just going to give it, and if we give it to you, if you commit to using it for a week or a day, can we talk to you afterwards about the value of that? And so I think this training wheel principle of design, they're very transitional products. They're not about coming up with really shiny solutions. We're really lucky. We do a lot of prototyping. We build stuff really fast. I think that you really have to build things and try it really, just lots of experimentation. We're lucky that we have access to all the different clinical staff, and so they'll look at anything. And the nurses in particular are like really harsh critics, and they're fantastic. And so if you give them lunch and put them in a room and say, what do you think of this? They're very, very frank. And it gives us this amazing feedback loop from our users. And the same with patients. We have amazing access to patients. We have a lab a couple of floors down from where we are. We simulate a lot of stuff, and so we're lucky also that it's a great investment is that we kind of bring clinical teams through there with their patients. We'll start scheduling patients. And then we have like front of house, back of house. And so we start changing the way they're practicing in their clinic. And there's a huge risk in that. And so behind the scenes, we have people double checking everything. So we staff, and so we manage the risk for them. I'll skip that because we have more. So on the last couple of ideas. This comes from like thinking really generally about, again, having worked in a lot of different innovation groups. I think it's really important that if something's broken in your system, you don't fix it. I mean, don't run around fixing things. And my impression from working in innovation is that people either think innovation is lots of just making a lot of stuff. But it's also about fixing stuff. It's also about trying to make problems go away. And sometimes it's much more about pausing and being really good at analyzing why the problem is presenting itself. It's like good medicine, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of really pause and pay attention to if something's not working in your products or your services or what you're doing, you really should be able to characterize why it's not working first. Innovation that's additive is really tolerated, and innovation that's subtractive or destructive is really threatening. And this is a really enduring experience I've had where working in innovation, people look at you and say, "Are you going to make you're going to make really cool stuff, right? Like you're going to give us, can you show us what you made?" And they assume you're going to create things as part of innovation, and a lot of innovation is about trying to just get rid of stuff that's really redundant. And so this kind of destructive principles in innovation are very hard to do. And I think it's something that in an organization your age and size, the real innovations may be getting rid of stuff. Implementation. We have this all at Mayo, it's really tough, is that in an organization we have to hand our concepts to a group called Systems and Procedures, and their job is to kind of integrate and to kind of implement and scale. And they often consider it like, on-ramping. So they have a system that's, in play. They have a massive practice with a massive kind of potential for risk. So you hand them something, and it's disruptive, inherently disruptive, and they're like, well, my job is to put this in the system and to mitigate any impact. And so I use the analogy of the square peg. So you go, here's our innovation, it's going to be really cool, it's very disruptive. And they're like looking at it going, this is like a square peg, and we have round holes, and I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to carve off the corners, and I'm going to make it, and I'm going to fit it right into the system, and it will just be the most benign, and no one will know it's even there. And so our challenge is to say, we wanted it to completely disrupt. We wanted it to challenge what was already happening. And what you want to do is you want to put something in that then the implications of it being there means that the things around it become redundant. You're trying to create those new pathways. So then you can take away all the bad stuff. And so it's really hard. Last slide. This is something I had said, again, something I've been kind of feeling about design is that when you work in design in communities such as yours or healthcare, there's something really important about protecting endangered emotions. People are having really strong reactions to their experiences, and often when they come into settings, maybe a financial setting or a healthcare setting, they often role play into appearing to be a lot more confident, or there's this kind of cultural expectations. People are able to talk about things themselves in a certain way. And I think there's a lot about damaging or not paying attention to the emotional aspects of things. And so I think it is, for us in design, it's really about protecting those really endangered emotions. The end. I did not too long.